Welcome to the Man Box Podcast. My name is Connor.
And I'm Kurt.
We're a father-son duo looking to have intergenerational conversations between men, by men, but not just for men. Do I call you Kurt? Do I call you Dad? Do I call you Dr. Michael? I'm not sure what I should do.
I don't know. What feels comfortable to you?
Maybe Papa?
Okay. You can, sure, try that.
I'm just playing. I think Dad's probably the best.
That's what you call me, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, why don't you talk about your background, Dad? Why we're here, why we're doing this?
I think having conversations around what it means to be a man, I mean, that's certainly been a big part of my life, my career. So I want to go kind of far back. I want to go back to 1989. I was a brand new graduate from college, and I got my first job at a adolescent treatment center for substance misuse. So that was my first job. And almost immediately, issues around teenage males became kind of a big deal. Like it was a co-ed facility, but almost immediately we got into the issue of what it's like to be a man, a boy, a teenager. What was interesting is that a lot of the young men that I was working with were contending with all kinds of pressures and challenges and issues. And so I just want to say that from the outset, that a lot of this goes back a long ways, not just in my professional career, but kind of what's happened to me just as a human being speaks to today, like why it's important to have a podcast like this. Like, of course, I know nothing about podcasts, relatively speaking.
No one does. Everyone's just starting a podcast now. You don't have to know anything.
Okay, well, that's good because I don't. So I worked for several years. I think it's around the time I met your mom. We both worked at that treatment center, and then we kind of followed these windy paths to our professional careers. You know, she's a clinical social worker. You know, I became a psychologist. And so all along, I know the issue of suicide has always been a part of my professional life, dating back to when we were working at that treatment center. I remember one young man who was really struggling, and he was on the rooftop of this treatment center, and we were trying to literally talk him off the roof. And he was really struggling. And one of the things that I remember him saying really vividly sticks out to me to this day. And this is 35 years ago. I don't want to disappoint my dad.
Wow.
And we got him off the roof that night. But tragically, not that much long after that, he died by suicide. Again, I didn't necessarily connect the dots about what he really said in that one moment. You know, I don't want to disappoint my dad. And then I remember when we had talked to the family after he had been on the roof, and we had to talk about, is he going to stay with us or is he going to be transferred to a different treatment center? And I just remember the dad at the table that we were talking, he was just bawling about his son's health and how much he struggled to try to help his son, and just felt like a failure, right? So son felt like a failure. Dad felt like a failure. And again, everyone was crying. The treatment team was crying. The dad was crying. Let's just pretend his name is John. John was crying. And we all kind of couldn't come up with a good solution. He stayed for another month or two, and then he got transferred. And about a year later, he died. It's always been on my mind about when I encounter young men who are struggling, especially around the issue of suicide, that initial conversation always kind of sticks out to me. And what was that all about? Like, what was he talking about? What was the dad talking about? So anyway, all that to say, all of my work does relate significantly to the issue of what it means to be a man and how do we help young men. So I think what is exciting about this podcast is trying to unpack that and try to understand that a little bit, not just for situations like with John, but other issues that come up, even what my perspective would be. And yours is probably going to be different than mine. This is not about being right. This is about trying to understand each other's experiences and the pressures that we face. And so I just think this topic more broadly deserves more discussion. And I think the unique part of this podcast is that we get to talk together as mostly grown men. Feel free to react to what I just said.
Yeah. I mean, we are living in a time where there is so much polarization, so much in every possible way. And just to have a conversation and sort of almost check each other, right, intergenerationally and say, well, this has been my experience or this has been my experience. That's kind of a rare thing in this day and age. And I think a lot of people will relate to that. And unfortunately, John's struggle is not a new one, nor is it the last one. Suicide and depression, do they disproportionately affect men the most?
That's a great question. I think it's sort of a mixed answer. So if we're looking at depression rates among young men and boys, let's say, they look pretty similar to young females and girls up to around the age of 8, 10 or so. And then prevalence starts to change. It's not to say that all of a sudden a lot fewer men young men show up as depressed, but we do see that more traditionally defined females tend to show prevalence rates that start to almost double by the mid-teens. And so it's not to say that, young men, the prevalence starts to go down, but in that dichotomous definition of gender, male, female base rates tend to rise, whereas boys and young men don't. And some of that, we believe, is our diagnostic criteria are not really that well designed for young people in general, but especially not for young men. Now, when it comes to suicide, that's kind of a different answer, because of all the people that die, between 75 and 80% of those deaths by suicide are young men and men.
Wow.
So maybe in some ways less depressed, but more often die by suicide. So that sounds contradictory, but sometimes we're not really looking for depression in young, let's say, teenage boys and men, young men, in the same way we assume it's true for young females. We often get kind of biased in our diagnostic thinking that, young men start to conform to rules of expression, the famous phrase, big boys don't cry. You've probably heard that.
Yeah.
And then admittedly, there's this not totally uncommon belief that men should be stoic. Men should not express themselves in ways that are reserved for different genders, right? So these are stereotypes we're talking about here. And I'm not saying that the base rates wouldn't be more even if we thought more expansively about how young men show their depression. So I'll just give you an example. Sometimes somebody can be really irritable. Well, what people don't always realize is that irritability is a core feature of depression. So if you're not necessarily experiencing your depressive episode as a low mood or feeling blue, it might be that your version of depression, which is not uncommon in young men, doesn't conform to these traditional assumptions around what it means to be depressed. So it also means that if you're irritable or if you show a lack of interest in things that you previously used to really enjoy, let's just take, a favorite thing of yours in, I assume currently and in childhood, music, and, you like to play the guitar. So if I were to sort of observe you as a young person, all of a sudden you're like, well, Dad, I don't really like to play my guitar now. I would view that as a concern because that kind of fits that definition of how people sometimes show up as depressed. The technical word for that feature is called anhedonia. Anhedonia is when people stop doing things that usually they get pleasure from. So if you were to stop playing the guitar, that would be, from a observational standpoint, the same to me as if you said to me, Dad, I feel really sad, right? So either one, in my view, as a psychologist, would be, I'm concerned about Connor being depressed because either he says he feels sad and has a low mood, or he no longer plays his guitar. And so your mom and I he probably didn't know this at the time, obviously, but we would notice things like that. We would say, well, geez, this is what he used to really love, and now he doesn't love it. And so we're worried about it. Or
yeah.
if you were seriously irritated, that's understandably a feature of depression, right?
Maybe this is a good segue to give my background and where I am as a young man. Young man, I'm on the cusp of 30. I guess I'd describe myself as a man boy. I can be
Okay.
confused for a younger age group, which I do take pride in that. But
That's cool.
Connor, here I am, man boy. Yeah, background about me. I majored in biology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and was on a pre-med track, as you are well aware. I think I always loved science and math and very technical things and just tinkering and was into like engineering kits and all the different not erector sets. I think that's probably more your generation, but sort of that sort of stuff. Building things, model kits.
Yeah.
We would build model kits, that sort of stuff. Very hands-on, very curious. But also there was a creative side to me as well. And you and mom had always encouraged me to lean into that. So playing guitar, getting me guitar lessons when I was really young and playing music and eventually producing and recording music, which led to a change in the path I wanted to follow. I started working in stage production, theatrical stage production, which led to an interest in audio and recording and live sound and all those things. Eventually ended up going to Berklee College of Music to study music production after UNC. I was too far along in the degree when I made the switch. I guess I could have dropped out, but that just felt a little too scary, just with all the investment you guys had made in my education. So I wanted to make sure I still had that degree to fall back on.
Yeah.
But yeah, so finished there, went to Berklee. Actually, I have a program in Spain, so graduated sort of into the pandemic, moved to LA, worked at a major recording studio, became a freelance mixer, engineer, producer, working in LA. And anyway, I remember growing up, it was a weird time, like things were changing, the idea of masculinity and what it means to be a man and what toxic masculinity is. I'm sure we'll talk about that a lot. There was like a transitional phase of sort of recognizing issues with men, around men, problematic behaviors perpetrated by men. Kind of as I was growing up, we had the Me Too movement in 2017, which was right smack dab in my formative years. It was interesting. Like, I feel like I got both sides of what you're talking about. I got the boys don't cry thing when I was very young, but I got the it's okay to seek help sort of later in college. And you're right. Whenever I was feeling depressed or just not good about things, I would sort of set my hobbies aside or sort of withdraw into myself. And that's interesting because I think that's how a lot of young men deal with their depression. Maybe they turn inwards, maybe they don't get the help that they need.
I'll just say just real quick, and then you can pick back up. One thing I can relate to in what you just said was, when I was a teenager, I remember, I had my fair share of struggles, and I would actually say psychotherapy saved my life. That's what I would say, because I think I was on a path of destruction. And I'm not even sure if I made full sense of it, maybe not even until way after that. I can't exactly explain where I came up with those ideas, but I had assumptions like I was not allowed, and I'm not saying that somebody specifically didn't give me permission to feel a certain way. I just felt pressure is about the best way I can describe it. I knew it was destructive, yet I couldn't. It was like a freight train. It's like I couldn't stop it. And I think because I got lucky, I actually ended up having a psychologist who was a very kind of strong, stereotypic. The word macho doesn't really capture it. It's more like he was just a really strong man. And by strong, I mean also emotionally in tune, right? Like there'd be things I would say and I would be saying it without tears. And then I would look at his face and he's not sobbing or ugly crying, but like there's tears going down his cheeks while I'm telling him stuff. It was very out of place for me. I didn't quite understand what was happening. I later kind of figured out that it wasn't so much that what he was doing was weird, but I didn't really know how to make sense of that, because I didn't witness my dad, who I adore, even though he's no longer with us. I still talk to my dad probably every day. He was kind of stoic. In my later years, I used to kind of think badly about that, but that's just the way he was, and I came to understand him for what he was. And so, no, that's interesting to hear you talk about this. And I don't even know, it could have been that you got some of these tendencies to go inward from me. You probably didn't learn that from your mom.
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely not mom. Mom's not to blame in any of this. Maybe I picked up certain things from you, but it probably came from grade school too, right? Peers in school, like saying that's gay, or why are you crying? Like you're just a wimp, or like other things that I really don't want to say because they're so hateful.
Right.
It's kind of a problem. Like kids bring, especially young boys, they mirror what they've experienced at home to the public forum, the school, and then that sort of gets dispersed to other boys, and it kind of spreads like an epidemic, if you will, right? Because you don't want to be the odd one out, right? If, like, let's say in 5th grade is when the sort of like, why are you being such a wuss, or why are you crying, you little sissy, or whatever people would say back then. Like, if you're a 5th grader and you're starting to be more social, you definitely don't want to be othered. If there's a group of your peers who are sort of telling you all this stuff and it's you against 5 of them, you're going to fall in line.
Or suffer the consequences. Right.
Or suffer the consequences.
Right.
Exactly.
And be rejected. Yeah, it's basically an impossible dilemma. You kind of lose in some ways, in both ways.
Yeah, and there's no way I don't think there's a way to mitigate this, like, truthfully, because kids are always going to bring what is modeled for them by their parents. And like, when you were a kid, the media landscape, technology was not as pervasive as it was when you were a young boy, like, let's say when you were a 5th grader. So I think a unique challenge of the time we're living in, especially with kids that are in 5th grade these days, is not only are they taking what they've learned from their parents and their household, but they're also taking what they saw on TikTok. They're also taking what they learned on Instagram. They're or YouTube or whatever, and that's all getting thrown into that peer pressure melting pot.
I can't imagine, if I have a less developed brain, how it would feel to me as a teenager. Just the 24/7 influx of just all this information with no way to sort or understand which of that data stream is factual, what's total bunk, stuff that's completely harmful. Like, there's no filter, there's no way to truly sort the data. That feels impossible.
Well, I want to get back to that in a second here, but maybe we can talk more about, well, like, what is the man box? Like, what is this title that we'll come to learn is aptly named for this show? What is the man box?
I think it's a good term to talk about. So maybe we'll talk about its history a little bit for a second, and then talk about where we hope to take these conversations. To me, the man box is kind of a starting point. The so-called man box, if you think about it, I mean, it's not a new concept, I guess, is my main point. But let's just kind of shout out some OGs that came up with some of these ideas that I think are useful to discuss. And the first one I'll talk about, David Gilmour. And as you point out this morning, not the Pink Floyd guy.
So it's not world-renowned guitarist David Gilmour of Pink Floyd.
It is not that David Gilmour.
That's kind of disappointing.
Yeah, well, I'm a fan of Pink Floyd, as you probably know and remember. So not that guy. But he's a anthropologist, actually. And I tried to look him up and see if he's still a professor. He was a professor at SUNY Stony Brook when he wrote the book. So he wrote a book, and the name of the book, Manhood in the Making, Cultural Concepts of Masculinity. So there's the book. And so he did this ethnography. He went across the globe and he interviewed and studied what it is to be a man. And I mean, I can't give you the number, but hundreds of cultures across the globe. And he spent years collecting data and trying to come up with, is there a universal definition of manhood? And I'm not sure he accomplished that goal, if that were a goal, but he did come up with some core concepts that I think are useful for this podcast called The Man Box, whatever it is to define manhood. And so let me just quote on page 223 of his conclusion section in this book that was published in 1990.
So everyone reading along, grab your book and turn to page 223, and we're going to have story time.
Yeah. Sorry to be professor-like. Sometimes
No. I'm just teasing you. It's great. It's great.
Oh no, I mean, it's something worthy of making fun of.
No. I mean, you have a physical book, and there's paper. It's not an iPad. That's great. I love that.
Yeah, here it is. So although there may be no, quote, universal male, unquote, we may perhaps speak of a ubiquitous male based on these criteria of performance. And so again, this is a quote, something like quasi-global personage called the man, the impregnator, protector, provider.
Wow.
So sometimes referred to as the 3 Ps, right? And I don't think his theory is that it's reductionistic to those 3 things. That's not his main point. But he did point out that these particular performative elements of being a man are fairly universal. And it's not to say it doesn't include other elements, but those seem to be big ones.
This is a common problem with other man podcasts, like podcasts talking about manhood and masculinity. This seems like something that could be very easily misconstrued and, like you said, reductionistic. So I just want to have you drill down even harder that this is not the definition of a man, but help contextualize for the average folk like me who maybe aren't practicing clinicians or scientists.
I think more as like organizing principles, not to say that, again, everything kind of fits into the so-called box, right? I mean, one of the different metaphors that involves a box is something from my background as a psychologist called the black box. And by the black box, we often think about what's not observable. B.F. Skinner came up with this concept that the reason that the behaviorist movement was so important is it had to be something that you could observe, measure, and manipulate, right? But the black box, so to speak, what's inside someone's mind, it can't really be studied as well because you can't touch it, see it. It's not tangible. So the so-called black box is something that's kind of a lot that's not known. And somewhat in contrast, the man box is maybe comprised of certain stereotypes or assumptions that, let's say, large swaths of society kind of takes as, universals or truths. And I'm not at all claiming that we're going to be able to unpack the so-called man box. I think what I'd like this podcast to be is be willing to really discuss different interpretations of the so-called man box. What's in there? Even if we think of, popular culture right now, if you think about some of the founders of this concept, we have to talk about people like Paul Kivel or Alan Creighton that started the Oakland Men's Project back in I want to say it started back in the 80s. And there was a programmatic approach to addressing manhood. I think it was developed into something called Act Like a Man Box from a programmatic standpoint, helping young people in the Bay Area kind of understand what it is to be a man in whatever form you are encountering. And then much later than that, there's a guy that comes on the scene who needs to be mentioned because he's a well-known discussant of this concept, a guy named Tony Porter, who's got one of the most watched TED Talks on the topic and wrote a really good book called Breaking Out of the Man Box. If people are joining this podcast, it's certainly worth watching Tony Porter's well-known TED Talk and certainly historically looking at some of the work that still continues to this day. I'm pretty sure Paul Kivel's still doing this good work. It's good to know kind of the origins and acknowledge these contributions along with, more traditional scholars like David Gilmour, not the Pink Floyd guy. So I just think for us to sort of level set, for the listeners to understand kind of where we're coming from, we're not coming out of the blue air in terms of why we think this is important. This has been something that has sort of not only a literature base to it, but also in popular culture. So I think we need to be ready to talk about what it means to a whole variety of people. I'm hoping, and you probably have this somewhere lined up in the discussion for today, but is it too soon to talk about kind of our hope to invite people on the podcast to talk about their ideas? Is that too soon to talk about that?
No, absolutely not. I'm sure we will be contending with the so-called manosphere, either indirectly or directly, when we work with this. And one of the key things that I think is wrong with that group is that they are incredibly reductionistic. They generalize things that should not be generalized. They frame things in black and white, and they typically frame things as negative or destructive, or this is what you should be, this is how you do it. That's not what we're trying to do here. I think what you said, and I'm just going to go to my artsy fartsy side here for a second, is more just to paint a picture, but this picture is more of a collage. It's not one single painting. It's a massive wall-sized collage of all of these experiences, kind of like David Gilmour did, surveying a bunch of men across cultures, getting their take on things. And so that comes through interviews, right? And then hopefully we can paint a picture of what modern masculinity is in a time where not many people are willing to do that for whatever reason.
I think that's a good summary. I'll just emphasize a point that I think you just made, is that our goal is to not help people hear our opinion about what's right or what's wrong. It's more like, what's the fabric look like? And it's going to be pretty different. And we need to have as many perspectives as possible. There are certain elements. I see nothing problematic about being a provider and valuing being a good provider. I see nothing wrong with that idea. Protector. How can you argue against somebody, whether male or female or any gender for that matter, wanting to protect their family? Like, that seems perfectly digestible for everybody. That doesn't require your male card, right? We can all kind of buy into those ideals. Let's talk about procreation for a minute. It's not just the man's responsibility for obvious reasons. There's lots of different ways you can have children. You can adopt children. You can, create children. And again, this is a well-known phrase, the idea of blood is thicker than water. I don't know. In my experience, I think, my connections to people often go way beyond blood relation, right? So to me, there's so much to include and so much to talk about. But I think our starting point, as you just said, is kind of let's take this concept and see where it goes. And let's try to make it so it's not harmful, right? Can we do things that are helpful? Can we talk about issues that might be new to someone, where they'll think about something in a slightly different way? I think that the one thing I've benefited, as much as I didn't assume that psychotherapy was going to help me, and that's honestly where I started, I thought it was a huge waste of time. And it took some time. It wasn't like it was instantaneous, but not only did I learn that I could benefit a lot from understanding my own experience, but the experience of others. What turned out is that what was beneficial for me personally actually turned into my career. So, I've been doing this for a long time, but I really think this is kind of a fun opportunity. I don't want to just get serious either. I want us to be able to have fun with this too. I mean, there's humor in a lot of this. I mean, some of it for me, my sense of humor is kind of gallows humor is my favorite type of humor. I think in part because some of the realities of my day-to-day in my professional life are genuinely hard. Like, it's hard to talk about people being suicidal or have died by suicide. Like, that's my day to day. And that's hard to do. And I think humor has to be part of this podcast. And I know that it will be. Like, I'm not practicing as a psychologist on this podcast. I'm just being me. Do I have a lot of experience to reference? I do. But a lot of what I want this to be is like more personal.
I don't know if there's many opportunities for practicing psychologists to just talk to a young person like myself in a forum like this, or whoever else we have on the show, right? So this is really unique. It'll be a good thing to hear some things outside of psychotherapy too, right? I'm sure you have a lot of anecdotes from sessions that you would be able to share, to have these sort of discussions about like, what is masculinity, what is manhood, what is this man box outside of that forum is really helpful. And it might even encourage some folks. You said you thought psychotherapy was a waste of time, and I would be lying if I haven't had similar thoughts. One small thing we could do that's good is give someone out there, give one listener, two listeners, maybe 100, the final nudge to get the help that they need, or to make a friend, or to reconsider their relation to the world as a man, and just to be better and to make the world better for everyone. That's kind of the point, but to do it in a fun way.
Yeah, that's really well put. Yeah, we want to be helpful and fun.
Helpful and fun. Doesn't everyone? What this podcast is not is, I think, from my perspective, and I want to hear what you think, is like, this isn't a recipe book of how to be a man. I think in some ways, this show's called The Man Box, but a lot of this is breaking out of that box and that constraint, and redefining manhood to fit your life. Define it in your world. I think being a man is different for every person in every situation. I think the other thing that I'd like to do, and I think we talked about this, is there's a lot of talk of toxic masculinity and backlash to men in general. The old adage, men are trash. You probably hear that a lot these days. Just men are terrible. They're just awful. They're womanizers and all these things. And all those things are true. And it's important that when we make statements like men are trash, we say, and this is how they can be better. There's a lot of just sort of similar. The internet, I'm sure technology and the internet will come up a lot in the show, as it's directly affected my life negatively, as it has a lot of people, I'm sure. The internet has this effect of catastrophizing everything. So men are trash. Yes, some men are very trashy. Look around.
Yes.
But it's important, especially for young men, to hear that, yes, men are problematic, but here's how you can be better. There's not a lot of discussion on like how to be better. There's a lot of tearing down. It's very easy to tear things down and to be negative and say, this is awful. What's much harder, and maybe that ties into like humans needing someone to blame, right? Like, that's a very human thing to need to ascribe blame to a group of people, or a physical thing, or whatever it is, right? So I think a much more interesting thing for us to do would be to arm men with the knowledge and tools that they need to be better.
Yeah, I like that. To be better. Yeah, so it's not just about what's wrong, it's about what's right and what can get us moving in the right direction. Okay. And I'll add one. So what it is not, this is not professional advice, and it's not any kind of clinical treatment. We certainly want folks to connect to care. So obviously I'd like a regular feature to be a reminder of where to go get access to no or low cost support, either in a crisis or not in a crisis. So we'll definitely be liberal in our provision of resources that people can turn to, even immediately, if something comes up during a podcast that's upsetting. And we want this to be an opportunity to connect folks to resources. So I want to be clear that though I am a licensed psychologist, I'm not doing that on this podcast.
Absolutely. And maybe we can drop some resources in the show notes.
Yeah.
I think this is a good place to wrap up for now. Like I said, we'll drop all those links in the show notes. And again, this is just a conversation sharing personal experiences and conversations. It's not medical advice or professional advice, right? Anything else to just add and reiterate there?
Other than to say that we really want this to be an opportunity to just talk about these important things.
Love it. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in for this premiere episode of The Man Box. Make sure to review us on whatever podcast platform you're on and submit your questions. We'll put contact info down in the show notes as well. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to The Man Box. If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with someone you care about.
If you like the show, make sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. The Man Box is produced, edited, mixed, and mastered by Connor Michael. Artwork is by Livia Michael.
The Man Box is not a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment. If you're struggling, please seek help by calling or texting 988 or visit 988lifeline.org. We'll see you next time.